Welcome back to the channel. And if this is your first time here, you have chosen the perfect story to begin with, because what I am about to tell you is the kind of tale that reaches into your chest and rearranges something fundamental about the way you understand love, grief, power, and the terrifying courage it takes to feel again after the world has taken everything from you. Make yourself comfortable, because we are going to be here for a while, and I promise you, every single minute will be worth it. Before we dive in, if you enjoy supernatural romance stories that go beyond the surface and dig into the complicated, messy, beautiful truth of what happens when two broken people find each other against every odd imaginable, hit that like button right now and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a story like this one. And now, let us begin. The fortress of Erebeth had stood for 400 years at the edge of the Thornvale Mountains, its black stone walls absorbing centuries of storms, sieges, and the particular kind of silence that accumulates in places where power lives and breathes and occasionally bleeds. The wolves who served within its walls had a saying, passed down through generations of guards and servants and advisors, that the castle itself had a heartbeat, slow and ancient and entirely indifferent to the comings and goings of the mortals who moved through its corridors. But in the 12 years since Kaelin Ashvorn had taken the throne of the 7 territories, even the oldest servants had noticed that the castle's pulse had changed. It had grown colder, more deliberate, as though the stone had learned to mirror its king. Kaelin Ashvorn was 34 years old, which in werewolf reckoning placed him in the precise center of his prime. The years when an alpha's power was fullest, and his instincts sharpest, and his dominance most absolute. He stood at 6 feet 4 inches of dense, controlled muscle, with dark hair kept short and severe, eyes the color of iron in winter light, and a jaw that looked as though it had been carved by someone who understood that beauty and danger were not opposites, but collaborators. He moved through his castle the way weather moves through open country, with a completeness that left no space untouched. Wolves twice his age stepped aside without being asked. Ambassadors from foreign packs had been known to forget entire prepared speeches the moment he entered a room. Children, whose instincts had not yet learned to be polite about what they perceived, sometimes began crying before he reached them, though they could never have explained why. He was not cruel in the theatrical sense. He did not enjoy pain for its own sake. He did not humiliate his subordinates or take pleasure in the suffering of those beneath him. What he was, with a precision that some found more terrifying than cruelty, was entirely without mercy, when mercy conflicted with necessity. He made decisions the way a surgeon makes incisions, quickly, accurately, and without allowing emotion to corrupt the angle of the blade. The 7 territories had been a fractured, bleeding collection of warring packs when he ascended. 12 years later, they were unified, prosperous by most measures, and held together by a combination of enforced law, carefully managed alliances, and the simple, overwhelming fact of Kaelin's alpha presence, which functioned less like a personality trait and more like a gravitational field. What the history books being written about his reign had not yet found adequate language to describe, because history books are authored by people who were not present in the private rooms and the unguarded hours, was the precise shape of what Kaelin Ashvorn had sacrificed to become what his territories needed. The historians knew about Marin. Her name appeared in the official record as his designated mate, the alpha female of the Silvercrest pack, bonded to him through the rare and ancient phenomenon the old wolves called a true thread, the kind of mate bond that did not merely create attraction or compatibility, but genuinely completed something in the soul's architecture that had been left deliberately open, waiting. She had died 8 years after their bonding, and 4 years into his reign, killed in an ambush during a diplomatic journey that should have been safe, in territory that should have been protected, by hands that should have been loyal. The historians recorded her death as a tragedy and moved on to the political consequences. What they did not record, because he had never told anyone, and had in fact spent 12 years ensuring that no one would ever have access to the information, was what the loss of a true threadmate actually did to an alpha. It was not grief in the ordinary sense, though grief was present. It was not heartbreak, though the heart was involved. What it was, the closest language could approximate it, was a kind of architectural collapse. Marin's presence in his bond had been load-bearing in ways he had not understood until she was gone, had been supporting entire structures of himself that he had not known required support. And when she died, those structures did not so much fall as simply cease to exist. He had not wept. He had not raged. He had done something far more permanent. He had taken the space where the bond had been, and he had built walls around it. Not metaphorical walls, but something his alpha nature had apparently decided to make literal, a kind of internal fortress that his wolf reinforced every single day, that kept the wound sealed and kept the absence from spreading and kept him, above all, functional. Functional was the word he returned to. It was the only word that mattered. The 7 territories needed a king who was functional. They did not need a king who felt things. This was the man, sealed and sufficient and terrible in his competence, who was carried back to Erebeth on a stretcher. In the gray hour before dawn on a Thursday in late autumn, bleeding from a wound in his left side that the battlefield healers had been unable to close, his body temperature running 2 degrees below normal, despite 3 warming spells applied by the pack's most experienced medics, his wolf so deeply suppressed that the soldiers carrying him could not feel the usual radiation of alpha presence that normally preceded him by 20 feet in every direction. General Roderick Vane, who had served under Kaelin for 9 years, and who was constitutionally incapable of panic, but had come closer to it in the last 6 hours than in the preceding decade, walked alongside the stretcher, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression arranged into the careful neutrality that soldiers learn to wear when they are afraid, and cannot afford to show it. The wound itself was not the primary problem, though it was severe. A blade had found the gap between Kaelin's armor plates during a skirmish with Undermere rebels, a group that had been causing intermittent trouble along the northern border for 3 years, and that Kaelin had ridden out personally to address with the kind of decisive finality that tended to end border problems for a generation. The blade had been ordinary iron, which should have meant the wound was ordinary, the kind of thing Kaelin's alpha healing factor would process and dismiss within hours. But the iron had been treated with something, and by the time anyone understood what that something was, the wound had stopped bleeding outward and begun doing something far more troubling, which was interfering with Kaelin's ability to shift, not preventing it entirely, simply making it wrong. The shift kept beginning and then halting, his body unable to complete the transformation, his wolf trapped in the in-between space that no werewolf was ever supposed to occupy, because occupying it for any extended period caused a kind of cascading internal damage that the senior healers, gathering in urgent conference in the corridor outside his chambers, were using the word irreversible to describe in increasingly hushed tones. The magic on the blade was old. Not Undermere. The Undermere rebels were 3rd-generation discontents with legitimate grievances about territorial resource distribution and absolutely no access to pre-Bronze Age binding magic, which was what the castle's chief arcanist, a small nervous man named Hollis Fenn, identified as the source of the contamination after 3 hours of analysis during which Kaelin lay in his bed, making no sound and moving very little, and radiating the kind of stillness that was far more alarming than distress would have been. Pre-Bronze Age binding magic was not a tool of rebels. It was a tool of someone who had planned this. Someone with access to very old knowledge and very patient intentions and, Roderick thought, standing in the corridor at 4 a.m. with the weight of the 7 territories, settling onto his shoulders in new and unwelcome ways. Someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment. The castle's healers failed in sequence over the following 18 hours. The first, a senior practitioner named Elder Dowan, who had been Erebeth's chief healer for 20 years, worked for 4 hours, and then came out of the king's chambers looking 10 years older and announced that the magic was resisting every countermeasure he possessed. The second and third, brought in from the northern pack territories by urgent messenger, lasted 6 hours combined before admitting the same. A specialist from the eastern reaches arrived by Wolf Run and lasted 40 minutes before the binding magic actively pushed his healing attempts back so hard that he needed his own medical attention. By the end of the second day, Kaelin's temperature had dropped another 0.5 degree. His wolf was making increasingly distressed sounds that none of the guards outside his door had ever heard from him before and found profoundly unsettling. And Roderick was standing in front of a wall in his private office, making a list of every option remaining and finding it shorter than he could afford. It was his wife, Sarah, a woman of practical intelligence and wide acquaintance who had spent 20 years as a military liaison officer before retiring to manage Roderick's household and, in practice, a significant portion of his strategic thinking, who mentioned Lyra Voss. She mentioned her the way she mentioned most things, simply and without drama, over a cup of tea at 5 a.m, while Roderick sat at his kitchen table, looking like a man who had been asked to solve a problem that did not have a solution. Sarah set the tea in front of him and said, "There is that Omega healer at the Royal Sanatorium, the one who worked on the soldiers from the Greyvale campaign, the ones with the cursed shrapnel wounds that nobody else could treat. You remember, Commander Palak's unit." Roderick remembered. He had not thought of her in that context, had filed her away in the category of extraordinary but peripheral, useful for unusual cases in the general population, not relevant to something of this magnitude. He looked at his tea. He looked at his list. He thought about the word irreversible. He sent a messenger to the Royal Sanatorium before sunrise. Lyra Voss did not know she was going to the castle when she woke that morning. She had known she was going somewhere she had not been, before when the royal messenger appeared at the sanatorium's service entrance at 6:30, which was earlier than royal messengers typically appeared anywhere, and handed her a sealed document bearing the Ashbourne crest in black wax, which was not something that happened to Omega healers from dissolved packs on ordinary Thursday mornings. She read the document twice, folded it precisely, tucked it into the pocket of her work apron, and went to finish changing the dressings on a young wolf. In bed 7, who had been brought in 3 days prior with a deep puncture wound that was being stubborn about healing, because the messenger had specifically stated that the situation was urgent, but had not specified the hour. And the young wolf's wound was also urgent, and did not have a general to advocate for it. She was 26 years old, though she looked younger in the way that quiet people sometimes do, as though the energy other people expend on performing themselves had been redirected inward toward something more durable. She was not small, though she gave the impression of compactness, of a person who occupied exactly the space required and no more. Her hair was dark and kept practically back from her face with whatever was available, which that morning was a piece of medical tape and a pen. Her eyes were a brown so deep they registered as almost black in low light, and they had the quality that the patients at the sanatorium had learned to rely on, of seeing past the performance of how a person was doing to the actual reality of how a person was doing, without making the person feel exposed or categorized by what they revealed. She had hands that were almost supernaturally steady. She had never in 6 years of practice reacted to a patient's condition with anything that could be classified as alarm, which the other healers found either admirable or unnerving depending on their disposition. She had come to the sanatorium the way most displaced Omegas came, to service positions, through a combination of necessity and the absence of alternatives. Her pack, the Ashenwood Collective, had been dissolved by royal decree 11 years ago when she was 15, in the aftermath of a territorial reorganization that Kaelin Ashbourne had implemented in the early consolidation years. The dissolution had not been violent. The decree had come with provisions, relocation assistance, integration support. In the way that official documents describe things, it had been orderly. In the way that 15-year-olds experience the sudden absence of every familiar thing, including the communal bond that werewolf packs wove between their members from birth. It had been a kind of death that did not leave a visible wound, and therefore received no visible treatment. Her parents had not survived the first winter after dissolution, not from violence, but from the particular despair that unmoored wolves sometimes fell into. The loss of pack bond operating on the nervous system in ways that medicine was only beginning to understand. She had survived because she was 15 and still possessed the animal stubbornness of youth, and because an elderly Omega healer named Bessa had found her in a relocation camp and handed her a purpose when purposes were the only things keeping displaced wolves from dissolving along with their packs. She did not hate Kaelin Ashbourne, This surprised people who knew her history, the few who did. She had examined the question carefully. Over the years, with the same methodical attention she applied to diagnostic work, and what she found was not the clean heat of hatred, but something more complicated, a kind of grief that had calcified around a core of understanding, because she had read enough political history to know that the consolidation had been necessary, even if its human costs had been handled with the bluntness of someone who did not fully account for what pack dissolution did to individual wolves. And she had learned early that grief and understanding could coexist without canceling each other out. What she felt about Kaelin Ashbourne was what she felt about weather. Enormous. Indifferent to her specifically. Occasionally catastrophic. Present. She arrived at the castle gates at 8:15 in the morning, on foot, because the messenger had not arranged transport, and she had not thought to ask for it, wearing her work clothes because the message had said urgent, and she had interpreted that correctly, carrying a worn leather satchel that contained her medical kit and a thermos of tea, because hospitals had taught her that you brought your own provisions to uncertain situations. The guards at the gate had clearly been told to expect her, because they opened the inner portcullis without the usual documentation process, which told her something about how worried the people inside were. Worry, in her experience, abbreviated bureaucracy. General Vane met her in the entrance hall. He was a tall man, with a soldier's posture and a diplomat's careful eyes, and he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has run out of better options and is hoping that the option in front of them is better than it appears. She had seen that expression many times. She found it useful, actually, because people who had run out of better options tended to get out of the way and let her work. He gave her a concise briefing as he walked her through the castle's interior corridors, his voice low and precise. The binding magic, the failed treatment attempts, the temperature drop, the increasingly compromised shift capacity. She asked 2 questions. He answered both completely. She asked no further questions, which he found either reassuring or more alarming. He was not certain which. Outside the king's chamber, she paused, not from hesitation, from habit. She always paused outside a patient's room for a moment, long enough to set aside everything she was carrying mentally, every preconception, every case history, every personal association, and approach the room as an entirely open diagnostic space. This particular pause lasted slightly longer than usual. She was aware of what was on the other side of the door, not just the medical situation, the person, the weight of what that person represented in the architecture of her life. She set it down deliberately, the way she set her bag on a chair, and when she opened the door she was, as fully as she knew how to be, simply a healer walking into a room with a patient in it. The room was large and cold, the fire in the hearth burning without managing to warm the space, which she noted clinically as consistent with the temperature disruption Vane had described. The medical equipment from 3 previous treatment attempts was still present, which gave her a rapid overview of what had been tried and failed. And then there was the bed, and in the bed, Kaelin Ashbourne. She had, in some theoretical sense, known what he looked like. His image appeared on official documents, on the currency minted during his reign, in the paintings that hung in public buildings throughout the 7 territories. None of these had prepared her for the particular experience of him in person, even diminished as he currently was. Even lying in a sickbed with his temperature running low and his alpha presence muted to a fraction of its normal intensity, he was still, even in this reduced state, the most purely dominant presence she had ever walked into a room with, the kind of gravity that was not performed but simply existed, the way mountains simply exist. He was awake. His iron-colored eyes tracked her the moment she entered, with an awareness that was sharp even through the evident physical suffering, and she understood immediately that the king's mind was not compromised even if his body was, which was both relevant medical information and a personal observation that she filed and moved past. She crossed the room, set her bag on the chair beside the bed, and looked at him with the direct, assessing attention she gave every patient. "I am Lyra Voss," she said. "I am going to examine you. Is that all right?" It was not quite a question. It was not quite a statement. It occupied the precise grammatical middle ground that she had found, over years of practice, worked best with patients who were accustomed to control. The framing acknowledged their autonomy without creating space for a refusal that would only complicate things for both of them. Kalen looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the clinical situation required. His nostrils flared slightly, the involuntary scent assessment that werewolves performed before they were aware of performing it, and something moved through his expression, too fast and too controlled to read clearly, gone before she could analyze it. "Yes," he said. His voice, even sick and low, had a texture like old wood, solid and dense and carrying. She examined him with hands that did not tremble and attention that did not waver, beginning at the wound site, which had sealed over in a way that was visually misleading, presenting as healed when what had actually happened was that the binding magic had sealed it closed to prevent external treatment from reaching whatever it was doing internally. She could feel it, the particular resonance of very old magic, under her palms, a vibration that was not quite sound and not quite sensation, but something between the two. She had encountered this register before, not frequently, but enough to have developed a working theory about how to approach it. She was quiet for the duration of the examination, not performatively, simply because she was thinking and thinking required quiet. Kalen did not speak either. She was aware of him watching her. She was accustomed to patients watching her. She found that the best response to being watched was simply to keep working. When she had finished, she sat back in the chair beside the bed and looked at him with the honest directness that she applied to all diagnostic conversations, which did not leave room for softening things that were hard, but did not, she hoped, confuse directness with cruelty. "The binding is pre-Bronze Age," she said. "It is using your own healing factor against you. Every time your body tries to repair the wound, the magic intercepts the healing energy and redirects it toward suppressing the shift. 3 previous healers trying to counter it from the outside accelerated the process because additional healing energy from outside provided more material for the magic to work with. I need to work with it from the inside." He was quiet for a moment. "Meaning what, specifically?" "Meaning I need to work in direct contact with your wolf," she said. "Not your body. Your wolf. I need to speak to the part of you that the magic is targeting and help it find a way around the suppression, rather than through it. This requires physical contact and an extended session. It will not be comfortable. It will take several hours at minimum and may take longer. And I need to be clear with you that I cannot guarantee the outcome, because pre-Bronze Age binding magic of this type was designed to be permanent, and I am working against the full weight of that design with tools that are several thousand years younger." She paused. She held his gaze. "But I believe I can help you. That belief is based on clinical assessment, not reassurance." Something in his expression shifted. Minute, the kind of shift that only happened when a person had been given too many reassurances by too many people trying to manage them, and then received honesty instead, and did not quite know what to do with it. "All right," he said, which was the most trust she had ever received from a patient who had known her for less than 20 minutes, and she recognized that, and noted it, and began to work. The hours that followed were unlike anything Lyra had experienced in 6 years of practice, which was not a statement she made lightly. Working with a patient's wolf in the direct, intimate way that this treatment required was not a common method, not because it was inaccessible, but because it required a level of sustained contact and openness on both sides that most wolves, particularly dominant wolves, could not maintain. The wolf had to be willing to be seen, not the person, who had various layers of choice about what they presented. The wolf, who had no layers and no filters, and presented exactly what it was, which in a king's case meant presenting the full weight of everything he was carrying, every grief and every fear, and every wound that had no physical location on the body. She had not anticipated what it would feel like to touch Kalen Ashbourne's wolf. She had worked with dominant wolves before. Several alphas had passed through the sanatorium over the years. Their wolves were typically large in the internal landscape, confident, sometimes aggressive toward unfamiliar contact, requiring careful management, Kaylin's wolf was all of those things. But beneath them, sealed behind architecture she had never encountered in an internal space before, she found something that stopped her breath for a moment. Pain, not the physical pain of the current injury, which was present and significant. The other kind, the kind that had been there for years, contained and maintained and structured into function, but present in every fiber of the wolf's internal landscape, woven through it so thoroughly that she was not certain where the wolf ended and the grief began. She did not comment on it. She did not react to it in any way that would signal to Kaylin that she had found it, because patients had a right to what they had not chosen to share, and finding something in the course of clinical work did not mean she was entitled to address it unless it was directly relevant to the treatment. She simply adjusted her approach, working around the sealed space the way water works around stone, patient and consistent and without force, and focused on what she had come to do. The binding magic resisted, thoroughly and creatively, and with the patience of something that had been designed by people who knew they were designing something meant to last. She spent the first 2 hours simply mapping it, understanding its architecture, finding the points where it was connected to Kaylin's own energy, and the points where it was running on its own reserves. She found the seams. Every construction has seams. She began, very carefully, to work on them. At some point in the 3rd hour, Kaylin spoke. He had been silent since she began working, which she had appreciated because it allowed her to concentrate. And his voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been before, stripped of some of the automatic armor that public voices carried. "You are from Ashenwood," he said. She did not pause in what she was doing. "Yes." A silence. The fire shifted in the hearth. "The dissolution was 11 years ago." "Yes." "You were 15. "Yes." She moved her attention to the next seam, which was tighter than the previous one, and would require a different approach. "You do not need to do this," she said, without particular weight. The way she would tell a patient they did not need to explain why they had delayed seeking treatment. "I am trying to understand why you are here," he said. "Helping me, because a patient needed help, and I was asked," she said. "That is generally sufficient." Another silence. Longer. She could feel his wolf paying attention to the conversation in a way it had not been paying attention to the silence, listening with the particular animal attentiveness of something trying to determine if there was a threat. "Most people in your position would not have come," he said. "Most people in my position did not study pre-Bronze Age binding magic countermeasures for 4 years, she said, which was the honest answer, and also, she found, the right answer, because it moved the conversation away from the territory of grievance and debt, which she did not want to navigate while working, and toward the territory of simple professional fact, which she was comfortable in. He was quiet again for a while. She worked. The magic gave slightly, not much, but enough to tell her that she had found a viable approach. When he spoke again, the armor was even further from his voice, and she recognized the phenomenon, had seen it in many patients. The way sustained physical vulnerability stripped the performance layer away, whether a person intended it or not. "Your parents," he said, and then did not finish the sentence. "Did not survive the dissolution," she said, completing it for him without the hesitation that would have made it harder. "I know. You do not need to carry that in this room. It is not useful to the work, and it is not a debt I am collecting on." She paused, and then said, "Because it was true, and because she thought it might actually matter to him. I understand why the consolidation happened. I have always understood why. Understanding and grief are not mutually exclusive." She felt something change in the internal landscape where she was working. Subtle. The wolf's attention shifted, from the listening posture of assessing threat to something else. Something she did not have precise clinical language for. Something that felt less like threat assessment and more like recognition. By the 6th hour, she had unraveled enough of the binding to allow Kaylin's shift mechanism to begin attempting movement again. Careful, tentative, like a limb that has been immobilized beginning to remember its range. This was the most delicate phase. She had to maintain a kind of steady presence in the internal space while the shift tested its own restored capacity, providing a kind of anchor that the wolf could orient to without getting in the way of the process. It required absolute stillness and absolute attention simultaneously, which was the most demanding clinical state she knew how to maintain. It also required her to be closer. She was already sitting on the edge of the bed, both hands in contact with the wound site. For this phase, she needed to bring her own energy closer to his wolf's access point, which meant leaning forward slightly, bringing her presence into the space directly above his chest, close enough that she could feel his breath, and close enough that he could, with certainty, smell her scent at its full strength. He did not move, but she felt something happen in the space between them, something that had nothing to do with the clinical work. A kind of recognition that moved through the wolf layer with a speed and certainty that was fundamentally different from conscious decision, and she filed it away very carefully in the part of her mind that was not currently occupied with the work, because she did not have space to examine it now, and because examining it would require more than the careful, controlled consideration she could currently offer. By the 8th hour, the binding had broken enough that the shift completed for the first time in 3 days. It was a partial shift, the hands only, claws extending and then retracting cleanly and fully, without the stuttering incompleteness that had characterized every previous attempt. She felt Kaylin's exhale against her hair, shaky and deep, the kind of breath that only comes out when something has been held for a very long time, and she sat back in her chair and looked at his hands and let herself feel, very briefly, the particular satisfaction that was the closest thing to joy she regularly allowed herself in professional contexts. "That is a beginning," she said. "It will need several more sessions to fully clear the remaining binding material. But the mechanism is functional, and the wolf can complete the shift. The immediate danger has passed." He looked at his own hands for a moment, then looked at her. There was something different in his eyes than there had been 8 hours ago, something that his careful control had not quite managed to reorganize back into its usual configuration. And she met his gaze with her own steady directness and waited to see what he would do with it. "How long?" he said. "The additional sessions. 3 more at minimum," she said. "Possibly 5. Depending on how the remaining binding responds." She watched him process this, watched him calculate something, the math of what 3 to 5 additional sessions with this particular healer represented, the math of what that meant in terms of sustained proximity and the stripped quality of contact that the work required. She watched him arrive at a conclusion that was visible not in his expression, which remained controlled, but in the way his wolf settled in the internal landscape, from the careful positioned readiness of an apex predator in unfamiliar territory to something that was not relaxation exactly, but was adjacent to it. "Then you will stay," he said. It was not quite an order. It was not quite a request. It occupied a middle ground that was entirely characteristic of the man she was beginning, carefully, and against her better judgment, to understand. "Accommodations will be arranged." "That is acceptable," she said. She began to reorganize her medical kit. Her hands, as always, were steady. Her pulse, which was her own business and which she was not obligated to disclose, was doing something that she would have diagnosed in a patient as early-stage physiological response to proximity to a potential bond match, which was information she placed very firmly in the category of clinically irrelevant and personally inadmissible, and would not be examining further. She was 26 years old and practical, and she had spent 11 years building a life on nothing but her own competence, and she was not going to be the person who developed feelings for the alpha king of the 7 territories while treating his magical injury. She was simply not. She had made this decision before leaving the room to find Vane and inform him of the treatment plan, and she maintained it with the same steadiness she maintained her clinical composure, which was to say, completely and without apparent effort, and with a significant amount of internal work that she was not about to disclose to anyone. She lasted approximately 4 more days before she admitted to herself that the decision was not holding. The sessions continued every morning, beginning at 7 and lasting between 4 and 8 hours, depending on the binding's resistance that day. The work required the same sustained proximity, the same deep contact with Kaylin's wolf, the same stripped quality of attention on both sides. What she had not fully accounted for, in her clinical planning, was what sustained intimate contact of this type did to a healer's own internal landscape. The way working so closely with another wolf's fundamental self for hours at a time created a kind of permeability between them. Not a bond, not yet, but something that made the boundary between her internal space and his less distinct than it would normally be. She began to know things about him that he had not told her, and that she had not read anywhere. The shape of his loneliness, which was enormous and orderly, and had been so thoroughly structured into function, that he had probably stopped perceiving it as loneliness, and simply perceived it as the nature of kingship. The way his wolf loved the territory, not abstractly but specifically, the way it held mental maps of every pack under his rule, and regularly took inventory in the way that a creature responsible for a great deal of land and a great many lives takes inventory, checking, verifying, noting problems. The way he ate, when he was not eating in his formal capacity, was methodical and without pleasure. Food as fuel, another thing that had probably once been different. And the place that was sealed. She found its edges more clearly with each session. The walls he had built around the wound that the historians called a tragedy and moved past. She did not approach it. She worked around it as she always had. But its shape became familiar to her over those days, the way a building becomes familiar when you walk past it enough times. And she found that she understood what was behind those walls, without needing to open them, because she had spent 11 years carrying her own sealed space, the place where the Ashenwood pack bond had been, the place where her parents' voices had lived, and she recognized in him what she knew in herself, which was the work of surviving the unsurvivable, by building very good walls. What she had not expected was that he would begin to learn things about her through the same channel. She realized it was happening on the third morning, when she arrived at his chambers and found him already awake and sitting up. And he looked at her as she crossed the room and said, without preamble or apparent deliberation, "You did not sleep well." Not a question, a perception. She had, in fact, had a difficult night. A patient at the sanatorium had been in crisis, and she had spent 3 hours in correspondence with the attending staff there, managing the situation remotely, and had not slept until nearly 4 in the morning. She had not told him this. She had not showed it, she thought. And yet he knew. She considered this as she set down her bag. "The permeability is bidirectional," she said. "I should have anticipated that." "Yes," he said. "You should have." Not unkindly. Factually. She looked at him and found, in the iron-colored eyes that were watching her, something that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. And she felt, inconveniently, and with no available clinical justification, a warmth move through her chest that she categorized firmly as irrelevant and moved past. By the 4th session, something had shifted in how he spoke to her. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden dramatic softening that stories tended to involve when powerful, armored men began to feel things. What happened was more subtle, and, she thought, more real. He began to ask questions. Not about the treatment. About her work in general. Her methods. The cases she found most challenging. The cases she found most satisfying. He asked with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were being told, who was actually listening to the answers, and then thinking about them and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated the thinking. She was not accustomed to being asked questions. Most people, including most patients and most colleagues, had conclusions about her that they operated from without much interest in testing them. Being asked questions felt, unexpectedly, like a kind of sunlight on a surface that had not been in direct light for a while. She answered honestly, because dishonesty was not in her available toolkit, and also because the permeability meant he would know if she was managing him. And managing felt wrong anyway, in this particular context, in this particular room, with this particular patient who was. She was increasingly aware, not entirely a patient in her mind anymore. He was also Kalen. She had started thinking of him as Kalen somewhere in the middle of the 3rd session. Not consciously, not as a deliberate decision, but as something that had simply happened, the way significant things tended to happen, without announcing themselves. On the 5th morning, General Vane was waiting in the corridor when she arrived. He walked with her toward the chamber and spoke in a low voice, his careful eyes watching the corridor ahead, and told her that the investigation into the blade's magical provenance had produced preliminary results. The binding magic had been applied within the last 6 months. It required access to very specific historical texts that were housed in 3 locations in the 7 territories, one of which was the Araveth Castle Library, and it required detailed knowledge of Kaelin's specific alpha signature, the unique energetic frequency of his wolf that would be found in the binding's targeting matrix. The targeting matrix of pre-Bronze Age magic was personal. Whoever had commissioned this had access to Kaelin's wolf signature. That access, Vane said, with the flatness of someone delivering information they found personally offensive, was not something an outsider could obtain. It required sustained proximity. Time. Someone close to the king had been involved. She went into the chamber and looked at Kaelin, who was sitting up as had become his habit, and who looked at her and said, before she could speak, "Vane told you." Not a question. "Yes," she said. She sat in the chair. "How are you?" He was quiet for a moment. It was not the controlled quiet of the first day, the kind that a king uses to maintain the appearance of being entirely in command of himself. It was the quiet of someone who was thinking about something that hurt, and was not pretending it did not. She noticed the difference. She noticed that she noticed the difference, and that it mattered to her in a way that was not clinical, and never had been. "Someone in my inner circle," he said, for the 2nd time. She understood what he meant immediately. The weight. Those words carried. The echo of Marin's death in the unsafe territory. The betrayal that was already inside his walls. "Yes," she said. "I know." "How?" he said, and then caught himself and looked at her with something that was, for the first time, entirely without the armor. Just the question. Just the recognition of what the permeability had given her access to. "You know," he said again differently. "I am not going to use it," she said. "What I know. It is not mine to use." She held his, and she said it the way she said everything that mattered, simply and with the full weight of its truth. "I know what it is to lose something that was load-bearing, and I know what it is to build walls and then find that the walls are also a kind of prison. And I am not telling you this for any reason except that I want you to know that I understand it, not as a healer, as someone who knows." The silence that followed was the longest of the sessions, longer than the working silences, longer than the thinking silences. It was the silence of something enormous and armored standing very still, recognizing something, deciding what to do about the recognition. "Your pack," he said, quietly. "Yes," she said. "My pack, and mine specifically. My parents, and the bond that I grew up inside of, and the version of myself that existed inside that bond, who was 15 and did not know yet that she would survive." She paused. "I am not presenting this as parallel to your situation. It is not the same. I am saying that I am not someone who does not understand what it costs." He looked at her for a long moment. His wolf was very quiet in the internal space, the quietest she had felt it in 5 sessions. Not suppressed. Present. Simply present, the way an animal is present when it is not alert and not afraid, and is simply existing in a space that feels, at least for this moment, safe. "I signed the dissolution decree," he said. "Ashenwood. I signed it." "Yes," she said. "I know. And you came here." "Yes." She met his gaze. "I told you why. You told me the professional reason." A pause. She considered. She was not a person who lied, and she was not a person who deflected, and she had run out, she found, of the kind of careful professional framing that had been serving as a middle distance between her and this conversation. "The professional reason is the true reason," she said. "A patient needed help. That part is entirely real. The part that is also real is that I am the daughter of Ashenwood wolves, and I am sitting in the king's chamber. And I am not doing it for absolution or revenge or any of the things that a story would require me to be doing it for. I am doing it because the work is what I have and what I am. And because, she stopped, resumed, because when I walked into this room 5 days ago, I met someone that I was not expecting to meet. That is honest. I do not know what to do with it, and I am not asking you to do anything with it. But I'm not going to lie to you about it either. Kalen was very still. His hands, resting on the blanket, were not quite relaxed, the barely perceptible tension of someone holding themselves in place. When he spoke, his voice had something in it that she did not have a precise name for, that she thought she might have called vulnerability in a patient, and something more alarming and more important than vulnerability in herself. When you work, he said, in the place where my wolf is, what does it feel like to you? She answered the question honestly, because he had asked it, and because she had committed to honesty, and because looking away from it would be a kind of cowardice she did not want to practice. Like coming into a very large, very cold room that has not had a fire in it for a long time, she said, and also like the room is trying very hard not to notice that it is cold. A pause. And also like the room, once you are in it, does not actually want you to leave. Another silence, dense with things that neither of them had the appropriate language for yet, things that were happening at the level of wolf and bone rather than the level of word and decision. No, he said, very quietly. It does not. That was the moment she recognized later. Though she did not name it as such in the moment itself, that was the moment when the territory between them changed. Not dramatically, not with the seismic event that stories often positioned as the turning point, but in the way that seasons change, gradually, and then all at once, until you look up, and the world is different, and you understand that it has been becoming different for longer than the moment of noticing. The 4th and 5th sessions were different in quality from the first 3. The work was the same. She was still working through the remaining binding material, still carefully unraveling the magic from the places it had embedded itself, and she was professional and methodical, and her hands were steady. But the internal space had changed. Kalen's wolf, which had been carefully positioned from the first session, occupying its territory with the deliberateness of someone who was allowing a stranger in, but maintaining very clear awareness of where the stranger was at all times, had shifted. The deliberateness was still there, but the positioning was different. The wolf was not allowing her to work in its space anymore. The wolf was orienting toward her. The way plants orient toward light, not because a decision had been made, but because something at the fundamental level had recognized something and adjusted accordingly. She maintained her professional composure throughout this. She was very proud of herself about this, privately, and without sharing it with anyone, because the alternative to composure was reacting to what was happening in the wolf layer, and reacting to it would have made the work impossible, and would also, she was fairly certain, have been terrifying for Kalen, who was navigating enough territory without her adding the information that his wolf had apparently decided she was something more than a healer and was currently treating her internal presence like it was a compass finding north. She finished the 5th session on a Friday afternoon, in the low golden light of late autumn, and sat back in the chair and looked at the wound site, which showed no trace of the binding magic. None. The flesh was healed. The wolf's shift mechanism ran clean and free and undamaged. The temperature had been normal for 2 days. She looked at her work and felt the quiet satisfaction of completion. And then she looked at him and felt something else entirely, which was the particular difficulty of finishing a job that had required your whole self and then trying to work out what your whole self does next. "It is done," she said. "The binding is completely cleared. Your wolf's shift function is fully restored. You should experience a full shift within the next 12 hours with no complications, and the temperature stabilization is permanent." She paused. "I will write up the treatment notes for your medical records and provide recommendations to your healers for monitoring over the next month. But clinically, the work is finished." Kalen was sitting up, as had become the position of their sessions, and he was looking at her in the way he had been looking at her for 3 days, since the room conversation, with That configuration of features that was not the armored, controlled expression of a king managing an interaction, but the open, direct, somewhat bewildered expression of a man confronting something he had genuinely not anticipated and was not certain how to process. "Then your work here is finished," he said. "Yes," she said, "and you will return to the sanatorium. That would be appropriate," she said. A long pause. The fire was steady. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing something beautiful with the Thornvale Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of amber and gray that she had never seen from this particular window before, and would not, in the ordinary course of her life, see again. "Lyra," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without her title. She felt it land somewhere that was not clinical. She looked at him. "I have not," he said carefully, as though the words were stones that needed to be placed precisely. "Permitted myself to want anything that was not related to the function of the throne in 12 years. A pause. "I am finding that this is more difficult than it has been." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about her walls and his walls, and the way walls that were built to protect something valuable sometimes ended up imprisoning that same something. She thought about what it would mean to stay and what it would mean to go, and what the difference between those two things actually was when you stripped away everything that was not the simple truth of it. "I did not come here to want anything either," she said, with the same careful precision. "I am also finding it more difficult than expected." The thing about Kalen Ashbourne, she was learning, was that he did not make grand gestures. He did not have the language for them, had apparently deprogrammed himself from anything that resembled emotional expression in the theatrical sense, in the years of building walls and governing territories. What he did instead was small, deliberate things that were weighted with the seriousness of everything he was not saying. He reached across the distance between them, unhurriedly, and took her hand that was resting on the edge of the bed, not the clinical grip of a patient, but the deliberate, careful hold of a man making a choice, and he held it with the particular steadiness of someone who did not do things like this often, but who, when they did, meant them absolutely. She looked down at their hands, and then looked up at him, and she did not pretend that her pulse was doing anything clinical. "I do not know how to do this," he said, and the honesty in it was so complete and undefended that she felt it move through the space between them like something physical. "I have not known how in a long time, and I am also aware that there is a particular complexity in the fact of who I am, and who you are, and the history between those two things." "Yes," she said, "there is. I am not asking you to set that aside." "I know," she said. "I would not set it aside even if asked." A pause. "But I am also not going to hold it against you forever as a reason to refuse to be honest about what is actually happening. The decree was wrong in the way it was executed, even if the consolidation had a rationale. I have believed this for years. I also believe that people are capable of understanding what they did wrong and being different as a result. I have not seen evidence of that belief being warranted in your particular case, but I have not seen evidence against it either. And I tend to extend the benefit of the doubt until I have actual reason not to." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she did not expect. "Tell me what I should have done differently with the dissolutions, what the decree should have said that it did not say." She looked at him. His expression was entirely serious. He was asking because he wanted to know, not because he was performing. Accountability. And she recognized the difference because she had spent 6 years reading what patients actually meant versus what they were performing. And what he was doing was something she had rarely seen from the powerful, which was genuine willingness to be corrected. She told him. She spoke for nearly an hour about pack bond dissolution and what it did physiologically and psychologically, about the relocation provisions that had existed in theory and their actual implementation on the ground, about what adequate support for displaced wolves should have looked like, and why the difference between the decree and adequate support had resulted in the specific kinds of harm she had personally witnessed and experienced. She spoke without rancor and without performance, simply and factually, with the clinical precision she brought to diagnoses, and he listened with the full, focused attention he had given to everything she told him. the kind of listening that was genuinely absorbing, and genuinely thinking and genuinely changed by what it heard. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "This information should have been in the original assessment. I did not ask for it, and the advisors who should have provided it without being asked did not do so. That is a failure of process that I am responsible for, regardless of where the immediate failure occurred." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it is. I am going to change the dissolution protocols," he said. It was not a grand announcement. It was a simple statement. The kind of statement that Kaylin apparently made about serious things, quietly and as fact. "I should have done this already. I will begin the review process when I am recovered." He paused. "I would like your input on the revised protocol, if you are willing to provide it." Something moved through her chest that was not clinical and not managed, and that she did not try to manage. "I am willing," she said. And if this were the kind of story where problems resolve themselves cleanly with the recognition of love and the willingness to change, that would be the place where everything settled into resolution and moved toward epilogue. But it was not that kind of story, because the people in it were real in the way that complicated people are real, and because the betrayal that Vane's investigation was tracing through the castle's inner circle had not yet revealed itself fully, and because the person who had put a blade in an enemy's hand had done so for reasons that went further back than anyone had yet understood. The revelation came 10 days after Lyra had finished the treatment, on a morning that had been unremarkable up to the moment it was not. She had been at the castle for 15 days total, in a guest suite that had been arranged with an efficiency that suggested Kaylin had given specific instructions, and she had slipped into a rhythm that was not quite the sanatorium, and not quite anything she had a name for yet. Spending her mornings in the castle's medical archive at Kaylin's invitation, reviewing historical treatment records that she had requested access to for research purposes, and her afternoons working on the revised dissolution protocol that Kaylin had formally initiated 3 days after their conversation. They saw each other in the context of the protocol work, in structured meetings that had the shape of professional interactions, and the subtext of something considerably more personal, and in the evenings, in a way that had begun accidentally and continued with a deliberateness that neither of them was performing ignorance of. They sometimes found themselves in the same part of the castle, in the library or the corridor outside the map room, and talked. The conversations were nothing like what she would have predicted if she had been asked, a week before arriving at Araveth, to predict what she would talk about with the Alpha King of the 7 territories. They talked about the territories, the specific ones she had knowledge of through her sanatorium work, and his through governance. They talked about healing methodology and the gaps in the current medical support structure for low-status wolves, which she had thoughts on that apparently no one had thought to ask her about before. They talked about history, carefully at first, and then less carefully, the old wars and the old politics and the way the 7 territories had come to be a thing that required consolidation in the first place. He was, she was finding, the most intellectually engaged person she had ever spoken with the specific quality of mind that took information seriously and processed it with genuine rigor. And the conversations had a satisfying density to them, a substance that she realized she had been hungry for in a way she had not fully known she was hungry. He was also funny, which she had genuinely not anticipated. Not in a performed way, not the deliberate deployment of wit as a social tool. He had a dry, understated perception of the absurd that emerged occasionally in the space of conversation, and which she recognized as something he had probably not shared with many people. Not because he was hiding it, but because most of his interactions did not provide conditions in which it could safely surface. She found herself, on more than one occasion, laughing in the low, honest way that she did when something caught her genuinely off guard. And she noticed that he watched her laugh with an expression that she had begun to understand was something he was trying to figure out what to do with. The investigation had been running in the background through all of this, Vane's systematic and methodical work of eliminating possibilities, tracing access to the historical texts, mapping who had been in a position to obtain Kaylin's wolf signature. The morning the investigation concluded, Vane came to the map room where Kaelin and Lyra were working. On the protocol, and he said the name, Elder Dewan, the castle's chief healer, the man who had spent 20 years as the closest medical authority to the king, who had treated every injury and advised on every health decision, who had, by the nature of his position, extensive and intimate access to Kaelin's biological and wolf signature over the course of years. The man who had been the first called to treat the binding wound, who had spent 4 hours in the room, who had known precisely which countermeasures to apply in order to appear to be failing without actually counteracting any of the binding's progress, who had recommended, after those 4 hours, that outside specialists be brought in, creating a delay of another 18 hours before anyone began working in earnest, who had, Vane's investigation had found, been corresponding with a foreign power that had significant interest in the destabilization of the 7 territories for the past 3 years. Correspondence? Conducted through a method of magical encryption that had only come to light because one of its recipients had been arrested in an unrelated matter in the Eastern Reaches and had given up the cipher rather than face additional charges. Dewan had already fled. He had apparently perceived that the investigation was closing and had been gone since the previous night, with a speed that confirmed he had resources and help that extended beyond his official salary. The investigation team was already pursuing, but the foreign power involved had long borders and longer reach. Lyra watched Kaelin absorb this information. She watched him not react, which was different from having no reaction, and she watched the work of it, the discipline it took to contain something that large. She did not touch him. They were in a professional setting, and she respected the distinction. But when Vane had finished and left, and they were alone in the map room with the maps of the 7 territories spread across the table between them, she looked at him and waited. "He treated me for 20 years, Kaelin said. Quietly, factually, the way he said everything that mattered. Yes, she said. He was in the room when the consolidation policy was being developed. When Marin was alive, he would have had access to the correspondence, the travel schedules, the security arrangements. He was not looking at the maps. He was looking at a point somewhere past them. He was the first healer called after she died. She understood what he was saying. Or rather, she understood what he was not saying. The thought that was too large and too horrifying to be spoken in a map room on an ordinary morning, that Dewan's involvement in the current attempt might not be the beginning of the story. "Kaelin," she said. He looked at her. "That investigation," she said carefully, "will need to go further back. Vane needs to know that it may need to go further back." A pause. "But right now, in this room, I want you to tell me how you are. Actually." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. And then he did something she had not expected. Not from him. Not in this room, with the maps and the morning light and all the architecture of governance spread between them. He sat down, which he had not done during the entire conversation, and he looked at his hands, and he said, in the voice that was furthest from the king and closest to the person, "I am very tired. I have been very tired for a long time. And I am finding that being very tired in a room with you is different from being very tired alone, in a way that I do not have adequate language for." She crossed the distance. She sat beside him, not across the table but beside him. And she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would help more than the simple fact of being present, which was the thing she knew how to do, had always known how to do, and which was, she was understanding, the thing he had most needed for a very long time. After a while he said, "You should know that I am not a simple person to be around. I am aware of this." "I have noticed," she said. "I am also not a simple person to be around. I have been told this." "You are very calm," he said, not as a contradiction but as an observation. "I am calm in the same way that you are controlled," she said. "It is not the absence of everything underneath. It is the practice of managing what is there." A pause. "In case that was not clear." "It was not clear," he said. "It is clear now." And then quietly, with the same deliberate precision he had brought to taking her hand 10 days ago, he leaned slightly so that their shoulders were in contact, a minimal, careful thing, and they sat like that for a while in the map room with the morning moving around them. And she thought about walls and what they protected and what they cost. And she thought that the view from a window that had been sealed for a very long time was probably extraordinary once it was opened. The investigation did go further back. It took 3 months, and Vane brought in specialists from the eastern reaches who had experience with long-term conspiracy cases, and what they unraveled was not a simple story. Dowan had been recruited 12 years ago, shortly after Kaelin's accession, by a coalition of foreign interests who had recognized that the consolidation of the 7 territories under a single strong alpha was a threat to the fragmented, controllable landscape they preferred, and who had decided that the most efficient way to manage this threat was not open conflict, but the slower, more patient work of erosion. They had cultivated Dowan over years, using his access to undermine Kaelin in incremental ways too small to be noticed individually, a healing treatment adjusted here, a medical recommendation subtly wrong there, nothing dramatic enough to investigate, and they had provided the intelligence that had made Marin's ambush possible. When this last piece was established with sufficient evidence to be certain, Vane came to Kaelin's study and told him. And Lyra was there because by that point, there were very few significant things that happened in Kaelin's life that she was not present for, not by design but by the natural accumulation of shared time, and she watched him hear it, and she watched what happened to him when he heard it, and she did not look away from it. He was still for a very long time, and then he said, to Vane, "Thank you. Please continue the investigation to its full extent and bring me everything." And Vane left, because Vane was a person of extraordinary intelligence and tact. And then it was just the two of them in the study, and Lyra got up from where she was sitting and crossed the room, and she did not ask permission before she put her arms around him, because this was not a clinical situation, and she was not being a healer. She was being herself, and herself knew, without question, that this was what the moment required. He did not respond immediately. She felt the rigidity of years of practiced self-containment, the whole architecture of the walls encountering something that was coming from the outside, rather than trying to breach them from within. And then, slowly, the way large things move, the architecture shifted, and his arms came around her, and he was holding on to her in the way that people hold on to things they are afraid of losing, with the careful desperation of someone who is only now beginning to understand the value of what they are holding. She thought about Marin, and she was not jealous of Marin. She was grateful for Marin, in the complicated way that you can be grateful for someone you never met who loved a person before you, who showed that person what love could be, so that they knew what to look for when they found themselves looking. She thought that Marin would have wanted this for him. She thought that Marin would probably have liked her, and she found this thought unexpectedly comforting. They stayed like that for a long time. Outside the study windows, the Thornvale Mountains were doing something with winter light that was difficult to describe, the peaks going from gray to silver, in the way that certain kinds of grief go from heavy to something that is still present but has changed its weight, and become, if not beautiful, then at least part of the landscape that you have found a way to live inside. "I want to tell you about her," Kaelin said, eventually, into her hair. "I have not spoken about her to anyone in 12 years. I would like to hear about her," Lyra said, and she meant it completely. And he told her, not all at once, not in the map room or the study, but over the days and weeks that followed, in pieces and fragments the way memory actually works, in the early morning when the castle was quiet, and they were drinking tea in a kind of companionable silence that had become the best part of his days, and late at night when the governance work was done, and they were alone with the particular intimacy of two people who had stopped performing for each other. He told her what Marin had been like, her specific quality of humor, and the way she had handled the court with a combination of charm and absolute titanium stubbornness that had driven Kaelin to distraction and admiration in equal measure. He told her about the day of the bond, which had been unexpected, because true thread, bonds always were, and what it had felt like to have the open architecture of himself suddenly and completely inhabited. He told her, in the sparest possible language, what the loss had done, and she listened to all of it without trying to fix it or contextualize it, simply receiving it, which was all anyone can do with grief that large. In return, she told him about Ashenwood, the specific texture of pack bond, what it felt like to live inside that kind of communal warmth from birth, and what the dissolution had done to that feeling, and the cold years after, and Bessa, who had given her work when work was the only scaffold strong enough to hold a 15-year-old together. She told him about her parents, not with the clinical distance she usually applied to that chapter, but with the actual feeling of it, the missing that had settled into a permanent low register but was still missing, still the exact shape of two specific people who would never be in any room she was in again. She had not told anyone these things in full, only in pieces to Bessa, and in fragments to the handful of colleagues who had gotten close enough over the years. Saying them in full, to this person, in this room, felt like opening something that had been closed so long, it had almost become architectural, and finding that the air behind it was breathable after all. The protocol changes went into effect in the 3rd month of winter. Comprehensive pack dissolution guidelines, developed in consultation, with an advisory panel that Lyra had helped compose, which included displaced pack members, Omega welfare specialists, and medical experts in the specific physiological effects of pack bond severance. The changes were significant, and the pushback from certain council members was significant also, particularly from those who had benefited from the lack of clarity in the previous protocols, and Kaelin met that pushback with the immovable consistency of someone who had made a decision and was not inviting debate about whether the decision had been correct. He was good at this. She had always known from his reputation that he was good at governance. Watching him be good at it in person, watching the way he handled the complexity of the council and the territorial disputes and the ongoing investigation into Dowan's network with the same focused rigor he had brought to every problem, was something she found she had no difficulty with at all. She had thought, before she knew him, that competence in a person with too much power was frightening. She was finding that competence in a person who was trying to use power more carefully was something else entirely. He proposed, if that was the right word, on a night in early spring, which was not a dramatic event, by the standards of the stories she had grown up hearing about alpha kings and their mates. What happened was that they were sitting in the library, she with a medical treatise, and he with territorial correspondence. And he looked up from his correspondence and looked at her across the table. And he said simply, "I would like you to stay, not as a consultant and not as a visiting specialist, as my mate, as my partner in this, if you are willing." She looked up from the treatise. She looked at him for a moment. The iron-eyed, careful, enormous, presently somewhat vulnerable man who had spent 12 years building walls, and who had been, in her experience, one of the most genuinely surprising people she had ever met. She thought about what saying yes would mean, the complexity and the weight, and the specific challenge of building a life with someone who had this much history, and this much power, and this many wolves depending on the decisions he made. She thought about what saying no would mean, which was returning to the sanatorium, and the work she loved, and the life she had built from nothing, and which was a good life, a real life, that she had not needed him or anyone to build. She thought about the difference between needing something and choosing it, and she thought that choosing was the more valuable act, and that she was, without reservation or performance, choosing this. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." If the court expected drama from the announcement, they did not get it. What they got was a formal declaration from the Alpha King, delivered in the throne room on a Tuesday morning, that was as precise and unambiguous as every other declaration he had made, and that was accompanied by the sight of Lyra Voss standing beside the throne in the exact posture of someone who was exactly where she had chosen to be, and was not performing comfort with the situation because she actually was comfortable with it, which was, several of the older court members later noted in their private correspondence, more reassuring than any dramatic declaration of perfect contentment would have been. The challenges did not disappear because they had made a decision. The investigation continued, producing names and connections that required managing. The council members who objected to the protocol changes did not simply accept the changes because they had been implemented. The foreign coalition that had orchestrated Doan's involvement was still intact and still interested in the destabilization of the 7 territories, and understanding the full scope of what they had attempted and why, and building adequate protection against future attempts, was work that would take years. None of this was simplified by the presence of a mate bond or the reconstruction of Kaylin's capacity to feel things. And she had not expected it to be, because she was a practical person, and she understood that governance was governance, and grief was grief, and the world was not reorganized by romantic partnership. What was different was that Kaylin was not navigating it alone, and she was not navigating her portion of it alone either. The work of integrating herself into a court and a castle and a public role that she had not been trained for, and that came with specific difficulties attached to her origin and her status, and the history between the Ashenwood Pack and the throne she was now, in the most literal sense, adjacent to. They navigated it together, in the pragmatic, honest way that 2 people navigate things when they have established a habit of honesty early and have committed to maintaining it, and when one of them is a very competent king and the other one is a very competent healer, and between them they cover a substantial portion of the relevant ground. The dissolved packs began receiving outreach within the first year. Formal communications from the throne that acknowledged the inadequacy of previous dissolution support and offered a process for claims and remediation. It was not a complete reversal, and it was not instantaneous, and it did not bring back what had been lost, because those were not things any governance process could accomplish. But it was real, and it was sustained. And it was, Lyra thought, reviewing the early responses with the careful attention she brought to everything she considered important. The beginning of something that might, over years and sustained effort, become something that resembled repair. She continued her work at the sanatorium 2 days a week, because the work was who she was, and Kaylin understood this without having to be told. And she took on additional work, developing training programs for healers in the treatment of displacement-related trauma, which was an area of medicine that was chronically underfunded and undervalued, and that she intended to spend a significant portion of her life improving. She brought cases to Kaylin when the cases had policy implications, and he brought governance problems to her when the problems had human dimensions that his analytical mind found harder to navigate than she did. And this was not a perfect system, and they did not always agree, and sometimes the disagreements were significant and required sustained effort to work through. But they worked through them, consistently, and with the combination of stubbornness and genuine respect for each other's perspective that made working through things possible. His shift, when it finally came complete and unimpeded in the days after the binding was fully cleared, was magnificent in the way that all true alpha shifts were magnificent, the full expression of what a wolf's nature could be when it was not suppressed or compromised or sealed against itself. She was there when it happened, in the courtyard of the castle on a gray winter morning, when Kaylin had decided that testing the recovery required an actual test. And she watched the shift complete with the clean, decisive power of something that had been waiting a long time to be fully itself, and the wolf that turned to look at her from the courtyard was large and dark and still, with eyes that were the same iron color as his human form, and that looked at her with a recognition that moved through the animal and the man simultaneously, and was the same recognition at both levels. She did not shift. Omegas of her particular lineage had a different relationship with the shift, softer and less frequently expressed, and her wolf communicated through presence rather than form, but she felt it, in the place where the old pack bond had been, and where something new had been slowly, carefully, over months of sessions and conversations and shared evenings, and honest words, beginning to grow, the sense of her wolf turning toward his, the way she had turned toward him in the clinical space, the way that fundamental things turned toward each other when they recognized what they had found. She thought about Bessa, who had handed her a purpose in a relocation camp, and who had died 3 years ago of old age with the dignified contentment of someone who had done what they came to do. She thought about her parents, and the warmth of the pack bond she had grown up inside, and she let herself feel the specific sadness of the fact that they would not see this, that the life she was building in this castle in the Thornvale Mountains was a life they would have had opinions about and wishes for, and would have wanted to know. She carried that sadness without letting it eclipse what she was in, because that was the practice she had learned from the years of building herself on her own terms, which was that grief and joy were not alternatives, that you could carry loss and still be fully present in the life you had found, that the sealed spaces could stay sealed and you could still open the windows. If you have made it to this part of the story, I want to tell you that I see you, still here, still listening, still holding this with me, and that means more than I know how to say. This is what supernatural romance can do when it reaches past the surface, when it asks not just who do these two people love, but who do they become in the act of loving. What does love ask of them? What does it cost? And what does it make possible? Lyra and Kaylin did not have an easy story. They had an honest one. And honesty, in the end, is the only foundation that anything lasting can be built on. If this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about or feel or carry, please leave a comment below and tell me what part of it stayed with you. Like this video and share it with someone who loves a story that takes love seriously. And subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about people who are complicated and wounded and capable of extraordinary things when they choose to reach toward each other rather than away. I will see you in the next one. Epilogue. 3 years after the morning in the courtyard, on a day in early spring when the Thornvale peaks were losing their winter ice and the territory below the castle was doing something green and insistent with new growth, Lyra sat in the window of the room that had once been a guest suite and was now simply the room she liked to read in, with a cup of tea and a letter from a former Ashenwood Pack member who had participated in the remediation process and who wrote to tell her that he and his family had secured land in the Northern Territory under the new provisions, and that his daughter, who was 7, and who had never known a pack bond from the inside, had just completed her first communal bond ceremony with the children of the neighboring Wolf family. His description of his daughter's face when she felt the bond for the first time was the kind of writing that did not know it was extraordinary. Kaylin came in without knocking, which was a habit they had settled into, and saw her face before she had fully returned from the letter, and came to stand behind her chair and read over her shoulder. And when he had finished, he was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when something had affected him, and he was deciding what to do with it. "Good," he said, simply. The way he said everything that mattered. "Yes," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder. The same deliberate, weighted thing he had done for 3 years. The small gesture that carried everything he was not a person who said in the theatrical way, but meant in every other way. She put her hand over his. Outside the window, the mountains were doing what they always did. Enormous and ancient and indifferent, and somehow, in this particular window, from this particular room, exactly right. The bond between them had grown into itself over the 3 years, not with the sudden complete quality of a true thread bond, which was not what they had, but with the particular strength of something that had been built deliberately, choice by choice, honest conversation by honest conversation, the sustained work of 2 people who had both survived the unsurvivable and had decided that surviving was not the same as living, and that living required choosing, actively and every day, to remain open to what was possible. It was not a simple bond. It was not a painless one. It was the most important thing in both of their lives, which was not a diminishment of everything else that was important. The work and the governance and the healing and the ongoing, never-finished project of building something more equitable out of the imperfect material of the world they had been given, but was the foundation from which everything else could be approached. She finished her tea. The letter was still in her hands. The mountains were still doing their ancient, beautiful thing outside the window, and she thought, with the quiet completeness of a person who has arrived somewhere and knows it, that sealed rooms were not permanent, that the windows in them could be opened, and that what came in, when you finally let it, was ordinary light, doing extraordinary things with everything it touched.